Language Advocacy Day Canada, February 4th, 2021. #LAD21. Closing remarks by Lindsay Keegitah. Thank you to our coalition partners for making Language Advocacy Day possible.
Let me introduce you please to our final closing remarks speaker, Lindsay Keegitah, a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law in Vancouver, author of Otter's Journey Through Indigenous Language and Law, and an exceptional storyteller. Lindsay is Anishinaabe and a member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation in Ontario. Each fall in her home territory, she helps run land-based Indigenous legal education camps for Ontario law schools. Lindsay has been a researcher at the Pascua Yaqui Tribal Court in Arizona, the United Nations, and the University of Victoria Indigenous Law Research Unit, and a recipient of the Law Foundation of British Columbia Public Interest Award.
Bonjour and dinaway magonitog, nije Anishinaabe nij bamadsig. Bangiat tagon in ata Anishinaaben, edeshgo tonji Anishinaabe moyan. Nigikin dodem, Keegitah indigo Anishinaabe mong, Lindsay Indigenous Jaganashi mong. Neashi winigiming donjaba. Hi everyone. I wanted to begin this small address today by using the language of my ancestors on my father's side of the family. The language is Anishinaabe Moin, which is spoken around the Great Lakes region primarily and is indigenous to that area. Just as I have family from there, I also have family that spreads across the British Isles, and some of whom came to Canada as early as the 1800s, and others are more recent immigrants. I'm thrilled about the theme of this year's conference and thinking about building bridges between Indigenous languages and newcomers' languages. They both are quite different, yet they are all in need of love, courage, respect, and continued diligence to ensure their continuance and vitality. I received this invitation to speak today because of my work in Indigenous language revitalization and to learn a little bit more about my learnings on this topic. You can see my book, Otter's Journey Through Indigenous Language and Law, which was published by the University of British Columbia Press in 2018. So I wanted to primarily share a story with you today. And stories are ways that we have passed down our knowledge and teachings for generations. They're not trivial or childish, but they can be very full of insight, and we can learn a lot from them when we pause to reflect on their teachings. The following story is called The Story of Red Feather. This is an Anishinaabe story, so again, indigenous to the Great Lakes region, and this particular version is adapted from a telling by Beatrice Blackwood as recorded in a book called Tales of the Chippewa Indians. So I will share this story with you, and then I will draw out two main lessons that we can glean from this story. So there was once a young boy called Red Feather who lived with his grandmother. His grandmother was a great provider who knew how to gather food from the lands and waters of their home. She taught her grandson how to shoot with his bow and arrows in order for him to also be able to gather food and support the family. They lived in a village near a great big frog meadow. When they would go to bed at night, they were lulled to sleep by the croaking of the frogs in the background. The grandmother told Red Feather many stories about the different ways of all the animals and plants who they shared their home with, such as the squirrels, owls, deer, beavers, and of course the frogs. Springtime came, and after many days, as those of you who live in Ontario know, the snow finally melted. In the evenings, the frogs would croak, and grandmother said that they were sharpening their knives so they could eat the crayfish, an important food source for the frogs. Well, one day Redfeather became very curious. He wondered how many frogs he could actually take with his bow and arrow. He found he could kill many. Next, he tried the crayfish and found that he could be successful at killing many of them as well. Now, his grandmother had taught him about the delicate balance they lived in with the many species around them, but his actions showed that he did not understand this lesson. Well, one day a heron came along and told Redfeather that he was really harming her family and that she would give him her best feather if he would leave the crayfish alone, as well as the frogs. She explained to them that she had a nest of babies to feed and that his wasteful actions were affecting her ability to survive. Redfeather laughed and said, "Ha, I don't want your feathers. You keep them and leave me alone. I'm having fun out here." Well, he continued on taking too much and disregarding the place that he should have within the web of beings in his home. So eventually all the different birds met together to figure out what to do about Redfeather, who was making life difficult for many of them. As they gathered together, they each explained the different ways Redfeather's actions were affecting them, how some had come to the point of starvation. And eventually, after much discussion, they decided that Owl could be the one to teach Redfeather the impact he was having on the other beings. So one evening, the owl perched himself on a tree close to Redfeather's wigwam and said, "Hoo, hoo." Redfeather's grandmother heard the call and said to her grandson, "Redfeather, come inside. Don't you hear that owl calling? He might hurt you. Please come in." But Redfeather had other plans. He went out and even tried to shoot the owl. He missed, and while he was looking for his arrow, the owl swooped down, picked him up, and flew off with him. He went all the way across the lake and up into an old oak tree where this owl's babies were. The owl put Redfeather down in there and told his babies, "Here is the one who has been killing all of our food. He is why we are so hungry and are struggling to live." The little owls all looked sadly at Redfeather. Over the next days, living in Owl's home, Redfeather learned about the suffering firsthand of the owls. He too became hungry, weak, and tired. He thought he might perish. He was so hungry. Redfeather was kept in Owl's home for many days, and he learned many lessons about who they were and his connectedness to them, even though he didn't see it before. Well, back in the village, all the Anishinaabe knew that Redfeather was lost. Grandmother asked for help from all the different living beings, and eventually they found where Redfeather was in Owl's nest. Grandmother knew that to make things right, she needed to offer a feast for the harm that had occurred, and that Redfeather could come back to her if he agreed to never again misuse the food that Creator had made for everyone. So this is how the story ends, and you might be thinking, what does this have to do about language? So on the one hand, this story could talk to us more about the need to live in balance with our environment and not take too much. But if we look deeply, I think there are two very profound lessons to reflect on that can teach us how to build bridges to protect, strengthen, and live with our differences, including our languages. So first, in Canada, we live in a multicultural society. Although we are all although we are all human and have certain basic and similar needs to one another, we also, of course, have differences. In the story, the careless and selfish actions of the young boy did not take into account the different needs of the other beings with whom he shared his home. And they suffered because of this disregard. Our languages are nourishment for our spirits, much as food is nourishment for our bodies. I hope that we can each be attentive to supporting one another to speak and maintain our languages as we need to, and not interrupt the nourishment that flows from speaking the sounds of our ancestors and our hearts because of carelessness or even willful disregard for one another's needs. Second, the different bird species took an admirable action in this story that we can learn a lot from. When they recognized the harm that was occurring to them, they met together in a council. They told stories about what they needed to thrive and how they were being harmed. They listened to one another. They decided on a plan of action. Owl was chosen to literally take Red Feather, bring him into his home so he could learn more about his family and what they relied on to survive. I see this work that we are doing together now as filling a similar role. Through education and stories, we are coming together across our differences to show one another who we are and ask for what we need in order to thrive. Indigenous peoples and newcomers alike have languages that are not the dominant ones spoken in Canada, English and French. I hope we can find ways to gently but powerfully educate those who are not aware about where we come from and advocate for our needs. If this means inviting those who harm us into our very home, our sacred and intimate spaces, I hope we have the strength to do that and maintain the hope that they can learn and that they will listen. I so appreciate the work that you're all doing and grateful to be a very small part of this conversation. Miigwech Bizindawieg, thank you for listening. And I hope that as you continue to reflect on this story and the many other teachings that have been shared in the other talks that you've been listening to and movies that you've been watching, and that you're able to synthesize the different lessons and find good pathways forward. Miigwech.
Wow, this was incredible. I think I can speak for everyone when I say this was amazing. The gently but powerfully advocating really hit hard. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for summing up our day of advocacy and sharing your story.
Language rights matter beyond the 2 official languages of Canada. LAD 21 proudly supports the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Thank you, Lindsay. We could not do this without you. See you in 2022. Find us on your favorite social media. Email us at languageadvocacyday@gmail.com or visit languageadvocacyday.ca.